Thank you very much, Chris. Nice to see you all here today. I hope you enjoyed the regional breakfast. We're here for the dance routine now. So I'd like to introduce the two distinguished senators from Oregon. Senator Ron Wyden and Senator Jeff Merkley. Senator Wyden has been a critical part from the inception of the Oregon Business Plan. We're very happy to have him here with us today. And Senator Merkley has been very supportive of the Oregon Business Plan goals. So this is an opportunity to find out what's going on the federal agenda. And I'm more than happy to start it off by asking the obvious question, which is things seem to be working quite well in Washington.
Just perfectly. Perfectly.
When I was a kid, I seem to remember that party line votes were the exception, and now they've become the rule. Can you give us a little insight as to the dysfunction in Washington, or whether or not you think that there's going to be an improvement in that in the coming months?
John, I don't think there is a more important issue than starting with this one, because in my time in public service, I've not seen this kind of polarization. There are a variety of reasons, for it. I never thought growing up, for example, that we'd see ideological TV in America, that we'd see TV that just kind of reinforces people's, predispositions. So there are a host of reasons. But there's no question it's taking place, and that's why I wanted to start with one straightforward message, and that is, given the degree of polarization in Washington, what I want more than anything else, I want my time in public service marked by an effort to try to bring people together. And that's what my energy work is with Lisa Murkowski. Even in this gridlock, we got a major hydropower bill passed that the industry thinks can bring 60,000 megawatts of power. We got the safety net renewed, $100 million coming to local government. That's what the tax reform efforts are all about with Judd Gregg and Dan Coates, the education bill with Marco Rubio, the Medicare reform effort with Senator Isaacson. And I think what John is starting with is just the right question. And the reality is neither side has the votes to get what they want. So either we find some common ground or it doesn't get done. And on issues like tax reform, you see the opportunity for principled bipartisanship. Democrats want to go after special interest groups. Republicans want a more efficient tax code. I'm going to use my seat on the Finance Committee to promote both. And to wrap it up, I think you're going to hear Senator Merkley and I take a simple message to Washington, D.C., and that is we're going to export some of the bipartisanship we saw at the Oregon legislature to Washington, D.C., and we're going to stay at it until they get the message.
Thanks, Senator Wyden. Senator Merkley, do you want to give us your perspective on that?
I just want to draw attention to what Senator Wyden said, that he wants his time in public service marked by the characteristic of bringing people together. And that isn't just a lofty goal, because he's been doing that throughout his legislative service. And I think it does mark the Senate that I saw when back in the mid-'70s, I was an intern for Senator Hatfield, the Senate that I worked for when I was at the Congressional Budget Office in the 80s. But let's do a little poll here. How many people think the Senate and House today are a smoothly oiled, well-operating machine? How many think there's something broken about Congress? Well, let the record show that there were no hands on the first half and a lot of hands on the second. I think a recent poll was that 92% of Americans think that Congress is broken, and it makes you wonder about the other 8%. Maybe they're not paying attention. Because certainly what we don't have is a process where issues get fully debated in committee, get to the floor, get a debate, get a vote. And that paralysis means not only that Congress cannot take on the big issues facing our nation, which is a big deal in and of itself, but it also is doing terrible impact to our international reputation, the way the world is viewing America, and it's affecting the spirit of our youth who look at democracy and they don't see necessarily what I saw when I was in high school, which is a nation that responded to the Great Depression, responded to the challenge of World War II, created the largest middle class America or the world has ever known afterwards, and kept addressing issue after issue. To do that, we have to end a lot of the paralysis. I think that the Senate did take a big stride forward in saying that we're going to not let advice and consent under the Constitution be block and destroy, so that we can, in fact, get nominations addressed. So I have found on issue after issue, Rural Energy Savings Program, resolution to end the war in Afghanistan, the end to secret law, the bi-state trucking bill, it's possible to get partners across the aisle. We just have to keep pushing and reaching and bringing together with the notion that after a November election, it's time to quit campaigning and start problem solving. Thanks.
Thank you very much. One of the things that we look at here in Oregon is a legislature that has a pretty good track record of bipartisanship in the last session. Since both of you are carriers of a long tradition of Oregon senators punching above their weight, we like the idea that this state, small though it is, has, from a population standpoint, has a disproportionate effect on national policy. So we're looking forward to seeing that in action. And Senator Wyden, one of the things that is, of course, important to the summit this year is how we can unlock our natural resources to help the rural parts of our state, which have suffered greatly and have a disproportionate piece of our poverty, our population in poverty. How do you see that we can do something to get the federal government to help us unlock those natural resources?
John, thanks. And thanks to the summit for putting such a focus on the rural part of the state. What I've always said is I'm from Portland. I love the city of Portland. My only frustration was I didn't get to play for the Trailblazers. I was too small, and I made up for it by being slow. And I'm not a United States Senator from the state of Portland. I'm a United States Senator to represent every nook and cranny in Oregon. And that's why Senator Merkley and I go to every county each year for town hall meetings. And fortunately, in the last month or so, apropos of John's question about, in effect, unlocking our natural resources, we've rolled out two major initiatives. One is on forestry, and the second is on the Klamath. And both of them are designed to make sure that we have economic policies that don't cause our rural communities to become economic sacrifice zones. I mean, if you look, for example, at the number of folks who are on SNAP benefits in rural Oregon, that's just unacceptable. The best anti-poverty program is a job. And that's why it's good that you're going to have fighting poverty on the agenda this afternoon. And let me just touch on what both the forestry and the water bill are all about. On the forestry bill, if you look at the picture of the rollout in the governor's office, you see leaders of groups associated with all of you at the summit. People like Andrew Miller of Stimson Lumber, Joe Gagne of Gagne Forest Products, Dan Justina, Alan Ford. These are leaders in the timber industry who said, we like this approach because it's going to give us some certainty to get investment back in the private sector. But we also had environmental leaders. We had advocates for the salmon. We had the scientists. We had the communities that are the guardians of clean drinking water. And the principle was all about one major consideration, and that is, let's practice good science. Let's get our forests healthy again, because that's what we need to have predictability and certainty to get folks back to work in rural communities. With respect to the water issue, I think the work that was done in the community is going to not only help the basin, I think it is going to be the national model for how to deal with tough water issues in our country. And Senator Merkley was extraordinarily helpful to us. We had a hearing on it in June. Everybody thought that this was a hopeless cause. We called an audible in the middle of the day. Folks came into the office. We had a game plan. So 5 months later, we were at the college in Klamath Falls announcing that we now have an agreement in principle after decades of fighting, an agreement that will put folks back to work in the agricultural sector, help our ranchers, help our small businesses. That's my vision of what we ought to be doing. Again, it's going to allow us to help people in a very hard-hit part of rural Oregon. But mark my words, the Klamath example is going to be exported all across the country because that's the way we ought to manage tough water issues in America.
Thank you, Senator Wyden. Senator Merkley, I know you have a keen interest in the growth of manufacturing jobs, more or less the rebuilding of our manufacturing base in the United States. Can you give us some sense of what you think the federal government can do to help that?
Certainly, and this is very relevant to the goals of the business plan to increase the number of jobs and increase the number of the median income, better paying jobs as well as more jobs. And it's a challenge in which we're really going the wrong direction right now. That is, nationwide, 60% of the jobs we lost in the 2008 recession were living wage jobs, and only 40% of the jobs that we got back were living wage jobs. And when the difference for a family is between a strong foundation for a family to thrive and a situation where they're wrestling with going from basically minimum wage to minimum wage without benefits. So manufacturing plays directly into this because manufacturing pays significantly above the median. And here in Oregon, we are more dependent upon manufacturing than any other state. 29% of our GDP is tied into manufacturing, which is about 3% more than anyone else. And so I have been doing a Made in Oregon manufacturing tour, going from factory to factory, talking with the CEOs and the line managers and the workers about what is working for their company and how could they be more successful. And out of that have come a couple key points. One, and this is really the top point, is the training of folks ready to work in the manufacturing world, which essentially means that our children need to have their hands on tools in middle school and high school. I know this was the shop classes. Now it has a fancier name, Career Technical Education. But the BUILD Act that I've put forward is specifically about that, putting shop classes or career technical education back into the middle schools and high schools. We lost them in No Child Left Behind. We need to restore them, and that needs to be continued with a partnership in the community colleges and the Workforce Investment Act. So that is the first. The second was help with creating export markets. Obviously, you can make more things if you can sell them overseas. And there's non-tariff barriers that are relevant to that and simply advocacy for Oregon's products that is relevant. And the third is the ability to finance, access to capital to expand and improve the manufacturing process. So what it comes down to, this is very important to us because if we do not make things in America, we will not have a middle class in America. And when the middle class has more to spend, they have more purchasing power, which reinforces the positive cycle. But those three areas are the three that I'm focused on.
It sounds very familiar. If those of you that know the business plan agenda will hear echoes of that.
I've been paying attention. I've been paying attention.
Well, thank you very much. I think the other current event story that is on everyone's mind, given the last round in the budget cycle, is how are we doing on budget negotiations?
Oh, just hunky-dory. It's all done. Here's what the budget discussions really illustrate. It's the old adage that you've got to walk before you run. What the country needs so much is a long-term budget package. And that involves two issues. One of them is taxes, and the other is Medicare. Those are the two issues that are holding up a big budget agreement so that all of you in businesses really have some predictability and some certainty for the long term in terms of how you make your plans for hiring and for growth. I've introduced bipartisan proposals on both taxes and Medicare. I'll be rolling out a new approach on Medicare that's been able to attract people across the political spectrum dealing with chronic disease, because the reality is Medicare in 2013 is very different than Medicare when it began in 1965. A lot more cancer, stroke, diabetes, chronic disease. And I think there's an opportunity, again, an Oregon lesson, to give people better care at lower cost. So that's where we need to go, to have a long-term proposal. But you can't run until you walk. And so Senator Merkley and I are both on this budget conference that's dealing with what's called the budget sequester. And that is a Washington word for a really dumb idea. So dumb, nobody thought it ever would actually, happen, and of course it has. I was with Meals on Wheels, for example, a few days ago, and they talked about the consequences for their program, the inflexibility of the budget sequester. My hope is that Senator Patty Murray, who chairs the Senate side of the committee Senator Merkley and I are on, and Congressman Paul Ryan have worked with often, that they are going to be able to at least get a modest agreement to punch some new flexibility into the way the sequester works. It's going to be a modest agreement. I do think that the financial markets will react well simply because they're going to say, hey, those people in Washington, D.C. can barely order a Coca-Cola. At least they put together a modest agreement to modify the sequester. It isn't Oregon-style bipartisanship, but at least it would be a strong start. I think Patty Murray and Paul Ryan can get that done over the next 10 days.
Good to hear. Senator Merkley, do you want to add to that?
Well, in the year ahead, it's essential that we know now that there's not going to be another government shutdown. There's not going to be another game of chicken going to midnight as the clock ticks. And indeed, I do expect the budget agreement to come out to provide that stability for 2014. Many folks have been asking, are we risking another government shutdown? And I say, I don't think so. And then I note that I said that before the first government shutdown. And essentially, a shutdown is such bad policy. By various estimates, it costs our country perhaps $24 billion in GDP. Bad policy, bad politics isn't going to happen. I was wrong the first time, but I think the reaction re-emphasizes that people are going to work together. The folks on both sides of the conference committee disavowed any path that would lead us to another form of shutdown. Everywhere I've gone in the state, folks keep saying, we need to know what the lay of the land is. We can't keep having these crises every 3 months. That's no way to run a country, and it prevents us from making investment decisions. So as Senator Wyden noted, we need a longer-term stable vision. But at this moment, if we can get a one-year vision of agreement, that would be very positive, and that's what I expect.
Last question for both of you really pertains to the budget. Do you see that there's anything going on in this budget process that's going to put the federal government back into its traditional role of stimulating infrastructure spending?
Well, yes, I do. There are a number of bills that have been wrestled with recently that are related to infrastructure spending. One is the National Highway Act, which has to be reauthorized, and there's a lot of discussions going on around that. Another is the Senate passed the Water Resources Development Act, and every community, virtually every community, has a challenge with either the water supply infrastructure or the wastewater treatment infrastructure. And so the price of those changes has been a big barrier to investment. And therefore, we have a bipartisan bill that passed the Senate, and it includes the WIFI, Water Infrastructure and Innovation Act, that I sponsored. It's in there, so it's ripe for discussion. Now, whether it gets done in the Budget Act itself, because the Budget Act is, by definition, basically a single number, but it can set the framework for saying both sides will go back and address this key piece. And I'm hoping that type of understanding comes out of this. Certainly, it's sitting there waiting to be grabbed because you have Democrats and Republicans who've stood up in the Senate and passed this legislation and said it makes a lot of sense.
Thank you.
John, we heard the wonderful music with respect to the bridge, and when Senator Merkley and I heard all the singing, we were afraid you were going to have us dance or something out here as the second act. But the point is, no matter how you feel about the bridge, we desperately need new money for infrastructure. Particularly, we've got to find a way to bring some of this private sector money off the sidelines and invest in infrastructure. I think I found a way to do that. As part of the Recovery Act, I was able to get past something called Build America bonds. And we generated about $181 billion worth of new investment as a result of that, largely because the private sector wanted to come in. So on the Finance Committee, that's something I'm going to continue to pursue because I think it's a way to generate new revenue in a way that the public would accept. It also leads, and John, if I can just divert for a quick second to two sort of related kind of issues. Trade is so important to us. 1 out of 6 jobs in Oregon depends on international trade. The trade jobs pay better than do the non-trade jobs. Senator Merkley and I talk about making things here, growing things here, adding value to them here, and shipping them somewhere. We can't do that. We can't get them, in effect, started on the way to market without infrastructure. So there are going to be some big trade agreements that are going to be discussed in the Finance Committee and the Senate over the upcoming year, a year and a half. They're going to involve trade, but they're also going to have to involve infrastructure, because without infrastructure, we can't get those goods to market. And that leads me to one other related issue, John, and that is the Columbia River Treaty is up for consideration. This, too, is important for us. We've had this agreement, good relations with Canada for decades, but if we could pay in relation to the power we actually use, there would be hundreds of millions of dollars coming back to Oregon. This would be money that would be used, again, for infrastructure, putting folks back to work. So I think I'd just wrap it up with one last comment. After a town hall meeting recently in Southern Oregon, somebody came up and said, Ron, you know, it looks to me like that town, Washington, D.C., has just been consumed by a fireball of crazy. And I think that's a pretty fair assessment. I can tell you, Senator Merkley and I try to show up early and go home late, trying to counter it with Oregon-type solutions. That's what the summit's always been about for the last 11 years. Godspeed, Senator Merkley and I will try to make the federal government a better partner for the incredibly important work you're doing. Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much, Senators. We appreciate your support, and thank you very much for being here with us today. Thanks.